Hi, everybody. My name is Greg Hancock, and along with my fellow goldfish Patrick Curran, we make up Quantitude. We're a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In today's episode, we're joined by Christen Priddie of Indiana University, who will help us learn a bit about QuantCrit, its foundations, its purpose, and how it can enrich the quantitative methods process, to which we might have become a little too accustomed. Along the way, we also mention unknown unknowns, explaining the ocean, young Pat, cackling, how Greg pays for his kids' college, crap with a number, too young for the Muppets, grumpy old men, crowbar in the brain, bad maps, logical landmines, fluffy language, and storytelling. We hope you enjoyed today's episode.
A couple of episodes, we talked about things that come out of one setting and you apply to life in general. Mm-hmm. And I told you about my good buddy Mick, who was the fullback, and he had an entire life philosophy of follow your blocker.
Yep.
I got another one of those.
Okay.
And it comes out of one setting, but I really feel like it should guide in some way or another all of us on a daily basis, which is there are known knowns. All right. So when you and I were sitting on the bench in Inner Harbor in Baltimore.
After scaling the fence, that you were not aware that we were scaling. I loved that you marveled that nobody else was there. I was so in our moment. I had no knowledge that we were violating 6 laws to get to that bench where we were sitting. It's true.
And we didn't want to write another paper. We didn't want to submit another grant. And so we developed this boondoggle. And we got really excited because all we focused on were the known knowns. Mm-hmm. So we could do an episode on model fit. We could do an episode on mediation. The known knowns were used up by about episode 5.
We're out.
So that moved us to the second cluster of things, which are the known unknowns. Yep. And so you would text me, let's do actor partner, and I would text back some expletives and say, I don't know anything about it. And you would text back, well, read a damn paper. And so that brought us probably more episodes than we should admit of the known unknowns.
Yeah.
But again, the thing that should keep us awake at night are the unknown unknowns. Because how do you know you don't know it if you don't know that you don't know it?
You know, I'm scared to say that's one of the wisest things that's ever come out of your mouth.
That's like parent-teacher night where the teacher would say to my mom, Pat is doing as well as he's able. So that's one of the wisest things you're capable of saying. But why it worries me is we're just humming along doing our thing, but we have no freaking idea if we're not doing it in the best way possible because we don't know if we're not doing it in the best way possible.
Yeah, all these things that are underway that we're not really tapped into.
I can make it one worse.
Okay.
Which is, in principle, somebody can point out an unknown that you don't know that you don't know. God, I love this. But then it doesn't mean that it's easily explicable once it's pointed out. And I was reading a book a while ago and I ran across a phrase that I really liked, which is, how do you explain the ocean to a fish?
Ooh.
And it was this interesting book and talking about humanity and our place in the cosmos and things. Mm-hmm. But I literally put the book down and I was like, damn, that's it. How do you explain the ocean to a fish? And my premise in all of that is you and I are the fish.
So putting all of those things together, the fish, the ocean, the unknown unknowns, if I think about the research process as a whole, right? You and I are supposed to be these experts in the research process.
Sorry.
That was a live cackle from Patrick. You and I are so immersed in this ocean of the research process that we really have a hard time, I think, sometimes questioning what we do, stopping to think about the words that have been coming out of our mouths for 30 years that we're so practiced in saying and practiced in coaching other people to do, that we really don't question a lot of those things. And we have someone here today who is going to help us question those kinds of things. Our guest today is Christen Priddie. Welcome, Christen.
Hello.
Welcome, Christen.
Let me give a little bit of an introduction about Christen, and then we will come to understand why Christen is here. Christen's an assistant research scientist with the National Survey of Student Engagement, which is in the Center of Post-Secondary Research at Indiana University in Bloomington.
Yes.
I happen to know Christen through a program that we have here at the University of Maryland, which is an NSF-funded project where Christen is a quantitative research methods scholar. And it is for early career researchers who are operating sort of at the intersection of equity and STEM-related topics and STEM education, and who are interested in the role that quantitative methods play or could play in their particular research focus within that domain. So, Christen, one of the things that we do here is we'd like to hear people tell us a little bit about how they got to where they are. So can you give us a sense of your origin story, as we call it?
Yeah. So I actually started out in a different field. I got my bachelor's and master's degree in psychology. My bachelor's degree was at San Diego State University, and my master's degree was at Virginia State University, which is an HBCU, both in psychology. And those were really quantitative focused. As you all know, psychology fields tend to be. And how am I trying to say this? My own story.
It's fine, Christen. Let us explain it.
We can pick up from here.
Oh, yeah. But in my master's program, that is where I fell in love with education research. I realized that I really do enjoy research, the research process, and I enjoyed less talking to people about their problems. That was not a thing I wanted to do. And it scared me. I was like, I don't think I'm fit out for this. But research, behind the scenes, not talking to people, that's where I was at.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Christen.
Welcome, Christen.
Thank you. And at Virginia State University, I worked with a program called Project Knowledge, and it was designed for transitioning high school students to first year college for Black students. And so that was a really eye-opening experience, really understanding why Black students are in STEM fields. And it was a topic I never understood outright, but something internally I understood, identifying as a Black woman. So that's when I applied to higher education PhD programs. I went to Indiana and I got my PhD in higher education, where I learned a lot of what I'll be talking about today about QuantCrit. And right now I currently study Black college students in STEM majors and how they experience college environments through an equitable lens.
Yeah, and you gave away our punchline, which I'm so glad that you did, that today's topic is going to be about QuantCrit. And without giving more away, let me just say that we want the people who listen to this show to be critical consumers of research that they take in, right? Whether it's through their literature or through their day-to-day interactions with what's going on in the world. But we also want people to be critical researchers themselves, people who are very thoughtful about the process, people who maybe question the way things are done. And QuantCrit, in my limited understanding, and you are going to help us today quite a bit, is a lens to help us be critical of the research that is done and the way we do research. Is that a fair start?
Yes, that's definitely a good start.
So, Christen, as you're looking at us on Zoom, just see us as two little goldfish in a bowl, and you're going to explain to us the ocean.
That's all you have to do.
Yeah, it sounds like an easy task. So QuantCrit, and I want to be clear that QuantCrit has been interchanged with some other terms. QuantCrit is different than critical quantitative methodologies and quantitative criticalism. QuantCrit really specifically focuses on race and racism. And so it's all about reconsidering how we study race and racism through quantitative methodologies. The methodology comes from Gilborn, Warmington, and Dimmack. It was an article published in 2018, and that's where the term QuantCrit came from. It's guided by critical race theory, and it came out of a lot of questions understanding how oftentimes when we think about race and racism in education research, we tend to associate it with qualitative research. So we're trying to do a better job of thinking about how it's applied in quantitative methodologies.
So one of the things that you just mentioned in terms of the foundations associated with QuantCrit is its roots in critical race theory. And that is something that a lot of people, let's just say it generally, have a reaction to. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think it comes from not understanding critical race theory sometimes. It's become this big bad word, but I think it goes without a lot of context. And so Critical race theory is really about understanding how race and racism are endemic to the American experience, right? So the founding of America started with slavery, and it has implications on how we live our lives today.
Does that then offer a bridge to QuantCrit?
Yes. So when Gilborn thought of this topic, it's guided by understanding how racism is embedded in the research process. But a lot of people don't consider that because of how we're taught quantitative methods. We're taught it to be very objective, very neutral, very distant. So you don't put I in your writing. And I think when you're talking about race and racism, it's really hard to be objective about that topic in research methods. And that may be controversial to say, but that's what I think.
Yeah, so I came from a background where I have a degree in chemistry. I don't use it very often, although I help my kid with his high school homework, which means I have to go back and relearn high school level chemistry, even though I have a degree in it.
Well, and the meth lab in your backyard.
Hey, college tuition is expensive.
Okay.
Anyway, one of the things that I liked a lot about chemistry and the sciences more broadly was that I had this feeling of objectivity of the things that I was involved in. I had this feeling that there is an answer out there, and I am just chipping away at all the stuff around it to be able to reveal that answer. And when statistics found me, because God knows no one is looking for statistics, I felt like I had the same mindset, right? That there is some truth sitting out there, and what we have to do with some cool algorithmic methods is kind of chip away at the noise around it to try to get at that particular truth. And that's how we view quantitative methods, right? Some politician says a number, and then we all go, oh, well, that's a number. I guess it must be the case. And we often don't question things. But crap with a number assigned to it is still crap. And I think we need to be able to reflect on the quality of information we have, especially through this particular lens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's two focuses in terms of critiquing statistics and quantitative methods. I think there is one focus that does critique statistics in itself and where the numbers come from and the analytical method behind it. But there's another method or focus that's more on how do we apply this framing to current work and more practical uses of QuantCrit. So I think there are two focuses, and I tend to think about the more practical implications of using QuantCrit in my current work. But there certainly is, again, more philosophical, epistemological questioning of a positivist lens to approaching quantitative methods.
Did you ever see the Muppets?
No, I think I'm too young.
Okay, thanks. That makes me feel even better.
Sorry.
It's the Muppet Show!
It's time to play the music. It's time to light the light. It's time to meet the Muppets on the Muppet Show tonight.
In the Muppets, there are these two characters named Waldorf and Statler. And Waldorf and Statler are these two old white guy puppets who just kind of grumble and grouse about everything.
Do you suppose they have any life on other planets?
What do you care? You don't have any life on this one.
And Patrick and I have at times portrayed ourselves as that. He always says that he's Statler, which is the thinner, sort of more refined, elegant one, and that I'm the squatty, chubby little one.
Oh, yeah. Unambiguously, I'm the taller one. Was that your main point to all of this?
No. My point is that you and I sort of have this grumpy old white man lens, and I think it's time for us maybe to think a little bit differently. And what Christen said is that she tends to focus on the more practical and applied stuff. So what I thought we might do is just start going through the research process together and see if Christen can stick a crowbar in our brains and open them up a little bit as we go through. Does that sound okay with both of you?
Yes.
It is, and here's why I need you with the crowbar, Christen. Very briefly, one of my favorite authors on the face of the planet is Cormac McCarthy. And he has a 1 or 2 paragraph description about how having a poorly drawn map is worse than having no map at all because it falsely instills a sense of confidence.
He said that in any case, a bad map was worse than no map at all, for it engendered in the traveler a false confidence, and might easily cause him to set aside those instincts which would otherwise guide him if he would but place himself in their care.
And I sometimes feel that about my training. I came through a very white-dominated training program, but we talked lots about multiple group analysis and moderation and looking for conditional effects. And I start thinking, oh, I know how to do this. I can handle this if we have these groups. And, oh, intersectionality, oh, I can take an interaction. I can look at that. But now I'm back to the damn fish, which is I kind of feel like I know what I'm doing, but I'm really, really not. And so that makes things even worse because I would be better to have no map at all than the crudely drawn one that I currently have.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good point because the reason why I started looking into QuantCrit was because I was asking myself questions of why I do things. So I've learned quantitative methods in a very objective and neutral way. But in my doctoral program, I started asking questions of, well, is that the right way to do something? Or does that actually make sense for the population I'm studying? Because almost all my work studies Black students and Black people. And so oftentimes in the data sets I'm using, Black students are usually the minority in that group, 13%, 10%, where white students in that data set are usually 60, 70%. And so I started questioning, well, if I'm focusing on Black students in my research, do I need anybody else? And so I think that's where a lot of the questioning of, I've been given a map, but is this map applicable or workable for the population I'm studying?
Right.
And that's where a lot of my questioning in my doctoral studies came from. Is this line of questioning right? Does this make sense? But of course, I was a doctoral student, so I was like, well, am I qualified to even question decades of quantitative methods? So I definitely agree with your point, Patrick, about that.
Well, so let's start off. Before we get into the typical steps in the research process, let's just start with the research question itself, right? How we come up with the research question, how we think about the research question. What are some ways that we can maybe open up our minds a little bit, even from the start?
Yeah, so I think one consideration is thinking of asset-based framing versus deficit-based framing approach in the research questions is really helpful and a good start. So a lot of the questions that we'll ask are, why do certain students not have this? Or why are certain students different than another group of students? So a lot of my research is race focused, so I'll focus on examples of race. But oftentimes questions about Black students will be, are Black students different than white students on a certain engagement, practice, or an activity? But instead of looking at it as a comparison or why are Black students different, why don't we look at what drives or motivates Black students to participate in a certain activity or engagement? So I think that's one way that we can change our framing from the outset, looking at an asset-based approach of understanding Black students or minoritized people in general, as opposed to looking at them always having a deficit than the majoritized group.
And you said that your work tends to focus on issues of race, but are there other things that sort of resonate with this particular pattern that we can think about as well?
Yeah, so I think any time you're talking about a majoritized group versus a minoritized group, all of this conversation fits together. So if we're talking about gender in terms of non-binary, so not just man and woman, or if we're talking about sexual orientation, oftentimes sexual orientation is split up into straight, heterosexual versus everyone else. So how do we start privileging and focusing on the minoritized group voices? And again, not what they're lacking, but rather what drives them, what motivates them, what gains and benefits they're getting from any experience they're having.
So let me ask you, if someone is out there thinking, well, I don't do research specifically that involves race as a variable or gender as a variable and all of that, what I'm taking from what you're saying is that even people who don't have those as a specific focus maybe ought to interrogate themselves a little bit and say, but in the end, if I want to make general statements, maybe I should think about the role that those play in what I'm doing.
Yes, and I think that goes back to the premise of critical race theory, just understanding that even though it's not a variable in the study or in the research process, it's still having impact on people's lives that you're studying. So it's sometimes okay to not include that, especially if that's just not a variable. You collect it in the research process at the beginning. But I think it's disingenuous to say that racism, sexism, xenophobia, all of these isms are not at play in a person's life when they actually answered or responded to the survey or provided information for you to analyze.
So the things that you just said, Christen, remind me that we as the researchers are the ones who are making these particular choices about what we study and the way that we study it. How can researchers How can the fish think about the fish in all of this?
Yeah, and so I think that's where positionality statements come into play. And I think positionality statements and quantitative methods have been farther apart sometimes, but I think that's where we start to bring them closer together, because reflecting on our own identities and reflecting on why we came to the research question or the research interest that we have would really help us understand how we get to a certain place. And so I think this comes into play when people study populations or samples that they don't belong to, and reflecting on why is it you that should do this study. And oftentimes, I think that's where we get researchers who are in good faith, but sometimes make missteps because they don't truly understand the sample that they're studying in terms of how it relates to themselves and the work that they're doing.
Until very recently, I had never even heard of a positionality statement. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is and what role that plays?
Yes. The positionality statement plays a role of just having the audience understand where the researcher is coming from, who the researcher is, and why they are studying what they're studying. So I can tell you what it's not, because it's often misconstrued in various ways. So oftentimes positionality statements will be written up as, I am this identity, and that's it. And it's more concerning of, well, how does that identity play a role in the research you've done? So for me, I'm a Black woman researcher, Black woman scholar. And so if I study Black students, obviously my race will play a factor into why I want to study Black students, because ultimately I want to see all Black people succeed, right? So that is going to impact how I look at the research process. It's going to impact how I relate to the experiences that are reported from Black students. It's going to relate to how I understand the implications and the discussion of the study. So what are the takeaways from the study? As a Black person studying Black people, I may have different takeaways than someone who is a white person studying Black people because they don't live that experience. And so I really think with QuantCrit, it's a lot of known unknowns, acknowledging what you don't know, acknowledging where you may have missteps, acknowledging where there may be biases. And I think that's the part of quantitative research that we're still trying to understand how to weave in together.
Christen, you came up through the psychology training through masters, and I don't know how much you encountered this in your training, but this issue is often pervasive in psychology in treatment provision. Can you do parent training if you don't have children? Can you do substance use treatment if you've never had a substance use problem? And it seems like a common theme of, can you do this if you're not part of that group? And a couple of times already in the conversation, you've said that there are misunderstandings about QuantCrit and critical race theory. Is this another one that it's not saying you have to be a member of the group to be able to understand the group, but it's being open and honest about where you're coming from and what perspective you're taking?
Yes, absolutely. It's definitely about being honest about the perspective you're taking, because I think one thing that we need, and especially in quantitative research, is allies. And I don't think we think of allies in quantitative research often, but a minoritized person saying something about equity is different than a majoritized person saying something about equity. And so I think it's not that people can't study the populations that they're not a part of, but it's rather, can you do us justice? And I think that's where QuantCrit comes in, of understanding how a lot of research can be based in activism or activist notions to help uplift that group. And oftentimes what is done in the research process tends to tear down that group. So how do people who don't belong to that group respect and privilege the knowledge of that group as opposed to privileging the knowledge of themselves?
So now that I have articulated, or at least tried to articulate, the perspectives that I have, the biases that I may have, and so forth, how might these permeate some of the things that I do as I actually start engaging in the research process, whether it's my lit review from the start or actually thinking about the sampling that I'm going to do to get subjects that I'm going to study?
Yeah, so I think it's all about designing a study around the population you're centering. So I think what tends to happen too in research is that we say we're looking at Black students, but we haven't really had literature that talks about Black student experiences, is talking about everyone's experiences. We have theoretical frameworks that are not specifically catered to Black students or that minoritized student group. So what you're trying to do is apply a broad one-size-fits-all approach to a specific population, and that may not always work. And so I think if you say you're focusing on a specific population, how do you set up the conversation about that specific population? So is your literature review actually focusing on that topic? Another thing to consider is sampling. So oftentimes, too, we'll see in limitation sections that we didn't have a diverse enough sample or a representative enough sample. Then I think back to Patrick's point about being honest. Just acknowledge that this was a majority white sample. And so this is what I'm going off of, and this is the implications I'm able to draw off of it. It's okay to talk about what was done and acknowledge the fact that there wasn't diversity, equity, and inclusion or QuantCrit in mind in the study. The goal really is to be more honest up front about what you're doing, but also put it in text. What does that honesty look like in quantitative methods in the discussion section? And I think that's not what we're seeing enough. And I think QuantCrit is an advocate of understanding and appreciating and also recognizing those tensions.
You were very kind to share some readings with Patrick and me ahead of time so we could start the painful education process. But one of the issues that came up a lot in the things that we were reading had to do with just the idea of groups and how we think about grouping variables, which is something that's so natural to quantitative methodologists. How does that play into the QuantCrit world, and how should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, so I think the first question is, are those groups actually comparable? Because research on paper, sure, we can compare any group that we want, but contextually, socially, historically, can those groups be compared? And so again, going back to my research on Black college students, I always consider the history of higher education. Going back all those years, white students had a 400-year head start on Black students. And so to say that they would be equal and comparable now, I don't know if you can say that. So I think understanding if those groups can be compared is the first step. And the answer may be yes to that, but should they be compared? And so again, Black students, Black people have a very different lived experience than other groups. And so if we're not considering the whole context of their lived experience, can we compare them in the research process? And I think that's a question that I still struggle with. My dissertation advisor in my dissertation defense actually called some of my research logical landmines.
I saw them open for Van Halen in the mid-'80s. Logical landmines, they killed it.
Please welcome Logical Landmines! Come on!
But in my defense, he was talking about how in one area you do really, really well. And in the other area, that's where you misstep. So I think that's also with the newness of QuantCrit is that we don't have all the answers on how to do this. And so really just trying to build the castle as we go. But again, acknowledging and being reflective, I think, is part of that process.
So you have made reference a number of times to the Black students that you study or Black people more broadly. But even just defining what you mean by that can have some challenges. Isn't that right?
Yes, it definitely has its challenges because of the way it's measured. And looking at demographic items can also be a really good indicator of how to critique or how to question. So when we ask, what is your race ethnicity, where I get my data from, it says Black or African American. But most people don't consider Black and African American the same type of experience. Because you can be, for instance, Nigerian, which you're considered Black, but you're not considered African American. So under that demographic item, is that what you check, or do you check international? So I think we're still trying to figure out how to understand and study race. And it's not easy because the Black experience is a diaspora of experiences. We all don't have the same experience. I think it's also very tricky. And again, another logical landmine of me saying I study Black students and Black people but I'm also aggregating them in my own work and not acknowledging that they are a very diverse group. So again, there's definitely still missteps that I take even when I'm trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. There are a lot of the examples that I have in my classes involve gender, but it involves gender in the sense of this dichotomy. And I'm using data that were gathered where people maybe only had those two choices, right? And the more I use these examples in class, honestly, the guiltier I feel. I feel like there are times when it's a meaningful thing to be able to make comparisons among gross categorizations, but then there's the other voice inside me that says maybe the next study that someone does along these lines needs to be a lot more thoughtful about how this variable is treated.
Right. And I think back to my quantitative methods classes, and I wonder, too, if the professor even acknowledged that, yeah, these categorizations and the comparisons are tricky sometimes. We're going to do it for the sake of the example, but let's critique and question why this may not always be a good thing in different contexts. And so I think having someone more senior just acknowledging that this may be problematic is still moving the needle forward in terms of better understanding how we use quantitative methods to study different minoritized groups.
And part of the irony that I find is, given that we know something about quantitative methods as a field, is we don't always apply those principles to the very thing that we're studying. So for a number of years, I've worked at Carolina on the undergrad admissions. We're looking at issues of race and ethnicity and diversity and equity and inclusion in the review process of applicants. And we ask 8 binary items about, do you endorse this as your race ethnicity? And the really cool thing is you can endorse more than one. But the irony that always strikes me is we think on a daily basis in our modeling about discrete variables, continuous variables, ordinal variables, coarse categorization, but then we don't apply it in some of the very ways that we should.
Yeah, and I think about often when we talk about QuantCrit or just being more critical in quantitative methods, we'll talk about, well, why don't we change the measure? Why don't we ask just them to write in their identity, write in their race ethnicity? But you can get upwards of 100 different categories because if someone says they're Black, Asian, Mexican, and then another person says that they're Asian and Latino, then can we consider them the same thing? Can we put them in the same box? And so I think that's where the big conundrum comes in is how do we collect this information well? And that could be a really hard part. And I think that's what we're still trying to figure out.
If we move forward in the research process, we need to gather data on something. And one of the ways that we gather data involves constructing our own instruments or selecting instruments that exist in the literature for studying whatever we need to study. How should we look at that through a QuantCrit lens?
Yeah, so I think instruments are hard because often when you create an instrument, you want to make sure everyone can answer that question or answer the concept or construct. But I also think, too, if we're going into it saying that we're going to study a specific population, why not create the questions for that specific population? So one example I did in my research was I took the idea of Black women in leadership. So Black women in leadership, there tends to be a couple of tropes. One trope is that Black women can be too aggressive in their leadership or in their experiences, and therefore people don't want to work with them. Another trope is that Black women take care of everybody. It's called the Black mama trope. So one question I asked was, how important is it to you that you are the leader of your group? Knowing that for Black women, that response can be very different given the context of how we are perceived by our peers. And so that's just an example of using the population you actually want to study to create the items as opposed to making sure they're answerable by everyone. Again, everyone can answer the items, but I knew that I was using a base that was specific to the population I wanted to study.
That's an important message when it comes to issues of validation, right? And Patrick and I have spoken about validity from a number of different angles on previous episodes, but what you're saying, as I understand it, is that if you are studying specific populations, allowing them to inform the way you're going to be assessing these things can help with the validity of what you're trying to do ultimately.
Yes. But I think the question gets flipped on, well, what about secondary data, which is what I work with most often? And, if you can't control the measure, then how do you talk about what's going on? And so I think again, kind of the reflective nature, reflective practice of your work, acknowledging the measure of the data I'm using wasn't collected with anti-Blackness in mind. So I'm going to acknowledge that and move on. But just so you know, there's limited conclusions or implications I can make from this study based off of what I have.
I think as a field, we often very quickly forget the items. And what I mean is whether it be secondary data or even in gathering your own data, they just become Y1, Y3, Y5. You do a factor analysis, there's a correlated residual, but you forget the content of the items. Mm-hmm. So I came up through a very quantitatively oriented program, and it was never overtly anti-qualitative. Nobody was pejorative, nobody was dismissive, but it was kind of like, yeah, we don't do that. And I got baked into my perspective that qualitative research was not really generative research until I attended my first focus group with a room full of adolescents. And it was like, holy crap, this is where the items should come from. This is where you get into the trenches.
Yeah, and I always joke with my friends that I have a quantitative mind, but a qualitative heart. Because I truly feel that a lot of the principles that guide my research come from more qualitative notions of research. And I think we could honestly pull from qualitative research in more of the epistemological lens and understanding where we're coming from. But also we can recognize that critical work or critical race theory or intersectionality is not only for qualitative research. Now, it's difficult to apply to quantitative research, but a critical lens is not relegated to just qualitative work. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we're trying to merge the gaps in saying that quantitative work needs to also come from a critical reflective place, because as we have been doing it so far, it has the potential to harm specific communities. So how do we consider how we're changing that? And I think we can take a few tips from qualitative work.
All right. So given your qualitative heart, how does that drive your quantitative mind in terms of the methods that you choose to try to bring some kind of peace between the two, right? Because there are certain methods that we have this history of just using and repeating, and they're in no way informed by this qualitative heart. So how should our qualitative heart inform our quantitative mind?
Yeah, so I think one way I think about it is thinking about complex methods and why I'm using complex methods. So I can come out the gate and use regression for every single analysis, but is it actually answering the question I want to answer? Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, we don't need a structural equation model to answer all of these questions.
Whoa.
I know, I'm sorry. And I think sometimes with quantitative methods, we think that the more complex analysis, the better it is at understanding a certain population or understanding a certain experience. But oftentimes we can scale it back and simplify it to really get at the core of the group that we're trying to understand. So I think that's one way I've tried to fight back against the quantitative notions that complex is better. Another way I've tried to do that is just always acknowledging that there's people behind the numbers. And oftentimes that can be really hard, again, with secondary data, if we didn't collect the information ourselves, but acknowledging that anything I write is going to have an impact on someone's life one way or another. So my work focuses on collaborative learning experiences. And so if I write that faculty should be more intentional about implementing collaborative learning experiences in the classroom, faculty are going to read that and try to do something about that. So understanding that all of my work, all of our work has implications on how people are actually living, experiencing college, experiencing higher education. And I think sometimes that gets lost in quantitative methods where we're not understanding how it's going to impact people's lives. But there are people behind the numbers, and I think that's where my qualitative heart comes into play in terms of quantitative research.
So then when you're writing up your not structural equation model, in your results and in your discussion and in your conclusions, how do you frame those things in ways that help make sure that they are touching the people that you hope that they're touching?
Yeah, so I try to do a bit more storytelling. I was taught how to write results in a very stuffy manner. You talk about the result, you interpret it, and then you move on. Talk about the result, interpret it, and move on. So what I've tried to do is add, as my colleague says, more fluffy language to help kind of explain what's going on with the work. And Sometimes it doesn't always align with, again, how we're taught quantitative methods, but I've also really started to put more effort into the discussion and really telling a story, understanding how I found this result, here's what's relevant to that result in the literature, but here's how the context can also change this result. Here's how my framework can really help us understand the result. And if you used a framework that's specific to that population, then it all starts to tie together in terms of understanding the context socially for that group. So for my dissertation, I talked about Black student experiences and collaborative learning, but a lot of my discussion was talking about how anti-Blackness may be playing a role in that. It's not studied and I couldn't measure it, but I understand that all of these things are coming together and anti-Blackness is playing a role in Black students' experience. But I know it's an undergirding issue of Black people's experiences. And so I try to frame everything I talk about with that context to help situate it in understanding that although it's not measured, it's going to be a part of their experience, and we should acknowledge that. So I think those are a couple ways, too, of really humanizing the results section and the discussion section so it doesn't feel as robotic. You know, we're people, we have our thoughts and feelings about this work. How come we can't put it into writing?
I have to say, even though you use the word fluffy when it comes to storytelling, I like the storytelling a lot. And here's the main reason. If someone reads your work, they are going to tell a story about it, right? They're going to craft their own story. And the story that they craft might go too far. It might overgeneralize. It might make something more out of it, or it might not make enough out of it. But for your work to have meaning to somebody, they are going to turn it into a story. So if you are taking your discussion and conclusions and you are telling the story, then I think you're the person to do a much better job to guide the narrative of what comes out of your work than just leaving it to someone else to take. Did you say robotic?
Yes, robotic.
To take Patrick's robotic discussion and conclusions and then turn it into a story. So I like the storytelling thing a whole lot. So thank you for that.
So every now and then you hear a white person with great gravity and insight say, but don't all lives matter? And you inhale and you exhale.
Like I'm doing right now.
And you say there's more to it than that. Somebody could look at QuantCrit and say, but you're just talking about sampling. You're just talking about measurement. Is there more to QuantCrit than we should just be more thoughtful in the research process about everything?
Yeah, because I think, again, there's not enough reflection of how we bring ourselves to the research process. We do research as we think it's just not a product of our own thoughts, our own perspectives, our own experiences, but it definitely is. And I think especially for race and racism research, we have to acknowledge that we all, whether we want to or not, belong or categorize as a certain race. And so that is going to inherently change the way we conduct the research process. All of our research ideas come from somewhere. They don't just come out of thin air. It's like, oh, I wanted to study Black students and I have no reason to study this. I just want to study it. We all have a certain experience, whether it be from school, personal life, that influences why we want to study a certain topic. But I think that ties into the All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter experience, where again, we're not saying that your experiences don't matter, but we're just trying to focus in on how we can make Black experiences better. And when Black people's experiences are bettered, everyone's experiences are bettered.
So how do we start to tell the fish about the ocean? Where do we go from here to be, one, cognizant of everything that you've just described, but two, to do something about it?
Yeah, so I think the first step is understanding who you are in the research process. Where do you come from? Where do your ideas come from? And questioning on whether or not those are objective or neutral. And if they're not, then how can you make sure that your voice and your experiences are reflected in the work that you do, while accurately critiquing whether or not you can do that work? I think that's a really good start of just being reflective. A lot of the ways I started with this work is just questioning every part of the research process. So I questioned, am I the right person to be studying Black STEM students if I didn't technically live a Black STEM experience? Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm STEM adjacent because of psychology, but most people don't consider psychology a STEM field. So am I the proper one to adequately study Black students? So that's an example of just questioning, is this topic really one I should be focusing in on? And I find that I want to help Black students out in the STEM experience, and this is how I'm going to do it. So I think critical reflection is one. I think another one is reading. So there's a really good working paper by Wendy Castillo and David Gilborn about how to QuantCrit. And they really go into a lot of good nuggets about how to inquire on certain things based off the QuantCrit tenets and how to think about it and practically apply it to that. So I think that's a really good place to start. It's not so theoretical. It's much more practical of like, okay, if I'm looking at research questions, how do I do better by the research questions? If I'm looking at instrumentation or measures, what questions should I be asking myself to create better measures or sampling techniques? So I think that's a really good working paper to start off with.
Yeah, I will just say the appendix of that paper is a gold mine, right? They have an appendix of all the questions you should be thinking about as you go through the research process, things to ask yourself, and it's terrific.
Yes, but I also want to hone in on the fact that critiquing quantitative methods is not new. It's been around for a very long time, but the idea of QuantCrit is new. And so we're all still really figuring it out as we go. So I don't want people to feel like if they don't have a grasp on it, if they haven't done it well, they're failing at it. That's not the case. We're still learning as we go. So I think just acknowledging the fact that, hey, maybe this research project, you just implement one idea, and that may be the proper step you need to figure out how to implement 2 ideas in the next project. So this is also new. We're also learning. I don't do it perfect. A lot of people don't do it perfect, but we're doing the best we can.
I love that as an ending point, because a lot of times when we're talking to people of what is new research that needs to be done, if you're a grad student, if you're a postdoc, if you're a new faculty member, where can we go? And it sounds like this is a really ripe field for doing some important generative work.
Yes, absolutely. It really is, again, a new field and a new line of inquiry in terms of theory and framing. And so starting off with reading some of the papers, some of the working papers, and just understanding what it is first, and then figuring out whether it's applicable to your work or not, and then doing some reflection on how you can apply it.
I love that.
Thank you so much for joining us today, as I have had so much fun in this conversation. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you all for having me.
And thanks for your patience with us.
No problem.
Right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they go when they need someone to help them critically examine pretty much everything they do, besides their in-laws' house. You can also follow us on Twitter, where we are at QuantitudePod, and visit our website, quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find organized playlists and show notes, listen to past episodes, and other fun stuff. And finally, you can get cool Quantitude merch, like shirts, mugs, stickers, and notebooks, from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized merch go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You've been listening to Quantitude, the podcast equivalent of a bad map instilling false confidence since 2019. Today's episode has been sponsored by Quantsplaining, the greatest hits album by
Logical Landmines,
including the smash hit Positionality, whatever, and sure, those old survey items are valid for this minoritized population. And who could forget, there aren't many subjects like you, so I'll just group you with the other subjects who aren't like you. And of course, the classic, the more unnecessarily complex the model, the more impactful the study. This is most definitely not NPR.